It's frequently touted that the Quran was revealed 1400 years ago, and to so many of us, this is a primary fact, a fact that particularly surfaces whenever the book appears to agree with or affirm a recent so-called scientific discovery. And whereas the continued relevance of the book is solidified in such instances, it also reveals a somewhat problematic side. That is, the relevance of the Quran selectively accrues from present discoveries puts it at the mercy of the temperamental achievements of modern science, whereby it's only relevant whenever science says so. As such, the Quran, in its codependency on science, loses its divinity and becomes this brittle and elastic substance that bends and shapes accordingly. This dynamic is recognized amongst mostly Judeo-Christian theologians as concordism, the act of looking at scripture from the viewpoint of science, or of maintaining the relevance of scripture in a science-dominated age, as a way of rescuing it from total obsolescence, though obsolescence is tacitly acknowledged and expressed in the act. The issue, at any rate, lies in the enigmatic concept of history, or history as it's understood today. In this science-dominated paradigm, where the virtual current of progress, like time, flows forward, life commences with simple and crude forms that slowly grow in complexity along the era of time. This is the axiom that modern science proceeds from and swears by, as well as the lens through which it views the universe and life, and from which it tends to extrapolate and form its conclusions, as we discern this in all academic disciplines. In this cosmological setting, scripture, and particularly the Quran, is viewed as a historical document, something that belongs to the past, to an earlier phase of human development, to the Iron Age nomad and Bedouin, not to the civilized man living in an industrialized and urban society. But is it really a historical text? And does history really mean past, as in no more? Or is the modern sense of the term just a distorted understanding of the notion based on Darwinian cosmology? And in what manner does it involve the question of relevance? An immersive study of the Quran as an independent text sheds a different light upon it, and upon its so-called historicity. Having done so, it will be found that the Quran could not be described as a historical text, if by historical we mean anachronistic, for the conception of the term history has radically changed since it was first conceived and used by the Greeks, who were interested in eternal truths, from denoting knowledge by inquiry, to slowly acquiring its modern temporal connotations. If history is a place that contains and houses the relic of humanity, then the word does not do us justice, and where it may seem to be the case, the Quran, when it happens to recount certain episodes of history, it's not primarily doing so for the sake of correcting certain long-held misconceptions about those events, or treating a collective state of amnesia, though this be carried out as a necessary precondition. It only does so instrumentally, i.e., there's something instrumental about those events. The so-called past here is only a convenient tool with which it serves its primary and original aim, for the same reason that it chooses to articulate itself through conventional poetic devices, like similes and metaphors. In truth, by being, so to speak, eclectic and resourceful in its approach to the so-called past, we're playing historical events that are often thousands of years apart, and likewise, in its clairvoyant account of the so-called future, it's showcasing its transcendental force, or, from its perspective, the non-existence of temporal history. Here, the Quran does not accrue its relevance from any specific point in time, but quite the contrary. Its eclecticism represents a negation of the concept of time altogether. And in doing so, it becomes contemporary with us, something which is raised above the vicissitudes of changing times and changing tastes. As such, it had not been more relevant 1400 years ago than it is now, nor less relevant today than it was then. It persists as though in an eternal present. Its relationship to its reader is such that, as Gadamer writes, in describing classical texts, there's a consciousness of something enduring, of significance that cannot be lost, and that is independent of all the circumstances of time, a kind of timeless present that is contemporaneous with every other present. It's eternal in the sense that it's a book of motifs. It deals primarily and ultimately with eternal structures, with, as it were, Platonic ideas. It's not at all concerned with the transient aspects of existence. It outlines gives form to and registers with conscious clarity those archetypes that are typically considered spontaneous or coincidental, or, in the words of D'Alembert, those things which we attribute to a kind of chance because we don't unravel the causes, but which produces in us a conviction as strong as that born from axioms. It targets those recurring laws and phenomena which the scientific method of induction directs at the physical environment, but not in the subtle, lifeless, unimaginative, and almost fossilized abstractions of scientific thought, which here deals exclusively with rigid material categories, for the Quran takes those things as given. This, it must be said, is one of the chief differences between the ontological grounding of modern science and the Quran's, and scripture in general, and what makes them fundamentally incommensurable, hence our introductory statement, that the Quran takes as its ideal objects those things which science considers as given, and takes as given those things which modern science considers as ideal objects, i.e. the physical environment and the workings of nature, which also explains the adamantly behaviorist stance of modern science and its expedient insistence on rationalizing those things which it fails to understand as consequences of the things which it does. And we here recall the clash between the Cartesian school of philosophy and the philosophy of Vico, which, ironically, is one instance of the perennial conflict often construed as the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns between natural philosophy and the humanist tradition, between Sophia and Phronesis, between pure contemplation and application, though they belong together. The Quran is interested in things that matter from an eschatological viewpoint, i.e., those things that carry over into the hereafter, and the material world, in this sense, is all but transient, and therefore necessarily of lesser importance. Based on this, it can only be said that the cosmological and the historical/philosophical are essentially inseparable. One practically justifies the other. Also based on this, we find that it fills the epistemological gap long suffered in human sciences, and, by extension, the reason why there had been a gap in the first place. The human sciences detached themselves from theology and grounded themselves in the cosmological doctrines of natural philosophy, and was consequently neither able to justify history nor itself. The Quran, on the other hand, bases its entire philosophy and body of lessons on eschatology, on the distinction between this world, the transient world, and the hereafter, the eternal, which is why the words deen, roughly meaning creed, and dunya, this transient world, share the same root meaning. In this basic morphological form, the word dun is used to indicate a lesser stage, specifically a pan-ultimate stage, a panult, the phase before the last. The infliction deen is thus understood in its cosmological scope and connotations, and that's done, as shown in the last two videos, by closely studying the morphology of the word, by observing how the Quran uses the word in different contexts, as well as in its relation to the term khair, which, like dun, can be understood in the qualitative sense to mean better or enhanced, or spatially to mean supersedes, terminal, conclusive, specifically and exclusively with respect to its pan-ultimate. Phronesis, practical wisdom, is in fact what the Quran ultimately teaches. The instruments for this end are the various historical settings in which set archetypes and motifs are found interacting. The characters that have a way of reasserting themselves in exotic settings, to borrow Toynbee's words. It chooses to introduce them histrionically, rather than in the inactive, fossilized, and periodic table sense of science, because it's trying to set standards of comportment, and comportment is something dynamic and variable, and can thereby only be understood under the banner of challenge and response, not cause and effect. The Quran is not recollecting in this case, but cataloging. It's presenting various eternal challenges and the best possible responses to them, mediated through the prophets and those whom it deems fitting, and interestingly, it counteracts the statement that the human passions cannot be governed by the universal prescription of reason, because in this plane, one needs convincing examples which only history can provide them.